Gun control is a set of laws designed to regulate the sale and use of guns. Examples of gun control measures include licenses being required to buy and sell guns, the use of background checks, and even just getting rid of guns completely. In the United States, gun control is a hotly debated topic due to how pervasive gun ownership is compared to other Western countries and how high gun violence is, with proponents of gun control arguing that the two are linked. I'll spend half of this video talking about the pros of gun control and the other half on the cons, whilst allowing for each argument to receive a rebuttal. The main argument in favour of gun control supposes that higher levels of gun ownership cause higher levels of gun violence. The US has the highest rate of gun ownership in the world, with roughly 400 million guns in the country, or 120 guns per 100 people, as well as the 28th highest rate of violent gun death per 100,000 at 4.43, compared to other Western countries like the UK, where the rate is 0.06. The argument that flows from this is that any number of restrictive measures, such as those seen in other Western countries, would reduce this number of deaths. In response, opponents of gun control argue that gun violence and gun ownership are not correlated. They point to countries such as Switzerland and Canada, which have high levels of gun ownership, yet much lower levels of gun violence, such as suicides and murders. Furthermore, opponents of gun control point to America's peculiar demographic nature being at fault for its high level of gun violence. Gun violence in America is much higher in inner city areas than rural places. For example, compare the murder rate of 55 per 100,000 in Baltimore to 2 per 100,000 in Vermont, a state with higher levels of gun ownership. The argument that flows from this is that tackling poverty and inner city crime would be more beneficial for reducing gun violence than gun control. However, one could equally argue that Canada and Switzerland's rates of gun ownership is nowhere near as high as that of the US's. Both countries have about 30 firearms per 100 people, compared to 120 in the US. Furthermore, proponents of gun control point to not just the human costs of higher gun violence, but the financial burden of the US's healthcare system, having to fork out trillions every year to treat people with gunshot wounds. With money and lives being wasted, time is also wasted due to the cyclical nature of the gun debate in America, a debate that becomes newsworthy whenever a mass shooting occurs, before fading into obscurity again. Again, however, opponents of gun control argue that mass shootings only represent a tiny fraction of all violent gun deaths, and that banning weapons like assault rifles is futile when most shootings occur with handguns. Now, for the other side. The main argument opponents of gun control use references the Second Amendment of the US Constitution that reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." To many Americans, the Second Amendment represents not just the right to self-defense, but to privacy, property, and freedom from governmental tyranny, and almost a certain equality with the state. Thus, to these Americans, any form of gun control represents a reduction in their freedom. However, it's important to note that this interpretation of the Second Amendment is not universally agreed upon. Some stipulate that the Second Amendment only entitles a militia, an army, to bear arms. Proponents of gun control can point to the DC versus Heller Supreme Court decision to back this up. DC versus Heller was the first Supreme Court decision to represent the right to bear arms as an individual right. Beforehand, it had been seen more collectively. Talk of American citizens became the American citizen in DC versus Heller. Along these lines, the idea that any element of gun control risks trammeling American freedom can be contradicted by looking at any number of gun control restrictions that have been put in place through American history, such as those during the Mafia period, in the Gun Control Act of 1968, and the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1994. However, opponents of gun control continue to uphold their constitutional right to keep and bear arms, with emphasis on how it prevents crime and how it improves feelings of individual safety, for example, amongst women, as well as maintaining the argument that criminals will always find a way to get guns if ordinary citizens are dispossessed of their firearms. Overall, it's clear that proponents of gun control think that America's higher level of gun ownership is at fault for its higher rates of gun violence. Thus, they believe that by restricting gun ownership, it would prevent criminals and mentally ill people from getting guns, reducing rates of suicide and murder. Opponents of gun control uphold their constitutional right to keep and bear arms, but it seems that the debate essentially boils down to the premise that higher gun ownership causes higher gun violence, and whether or not you disagree or agree with this premise. Opponents of gun control argue that higher gun ownership prevents a lot more crimes than it causes, and that America's gun violence problem is more an inner-city, poverty-related problem, and that dispossessing ordinary Americans of guns would put them at the whim of these types of gangs and criminals. So that's the gun control debate. Thanks for watching. Please like, please share, and please subscribe.